What if one of the biggest strategic questions facing the United States today has almost nothing to do with missiles, nuclear programs, or even the next military confrontation in the Middle East? What if the real question is far more fundamental? Not whether Washington can project overwhelming military power into the Persian Gulf, but whether maintaining that dominance is becoming increasingly expensive, increasingly complicated, and increasingly difficult to sustain over the long term. For decades, the Persian Gulf has occupied a unique position in global strategy. It is not simply a regional waterway. It connects energy markets, financial systems, shipping routes, and security alliances that influence economies far beyond the Middle East. Because of that, every development around the Strait of Hormuz attracts attention far beyond the countries that border it. Most public discussion focuses on individual events, military exercises, diplomatic statements, sanctions, or nuclear negotiations. Those developments certainly matter, but they often obscure a larger question: how has the strategic environment itself changed? Military history suggests that great powers rarely face their greatest challenges during a single battle. More often, they encounter situations where every available option carries significant costs. Strategic planners sometimes describe this as a dilemma rather than a battlefield defeat, a situation in which action creates new risks while inaction allows existing problems to grow. Understanding that distinction is essential. Throughout history, geography has repeatedly shaped the balance between stronger and weaker powers. Narrow sea lanes, mountain passes, river crossings, and supply corridors have often allowed smaller states to influence much larger competitors. Control of these locations does not necessarily require matching military strength ship for ship or aircraft for aircraft. Instead, geography can alter the cost of maintaining military superiority. The Strait of Hormuz illustrates that principle clearly. Although relatively narrow, it remains one of the world's most significant maritime transit routes for energy exports. Any disruption, whether actual or merely perceived, can influence insurance costs, shipping decisions, commodity markets, and investor expectations across multiple continents. That reality creates a unique strategic equation. Military planners must consider not only how to defend freedom of navigation, but also how to maintain stability without triggering broader economic consequences. This is where military capability and strategic leverage begin to diverge. The United States continues to possess one of the world's most capable naval forces. Few analysts question its technological sophistication, logistical reach, or ability to project power globally. Yet modern competition increasingly involves more than conventional military comparisons. Over the past several decades, regional actors have invested heavily in capabilities designed not to defeat larger militaries outright, but to complicate their operations. Long Midas range missiles, unmanned systems, coastal defense networks, cyber capabilities, electronic warfare, and dispersed command structures all increase operational uncertainty. None of these systems necessarily overturn the military balance by themselves. Their purpose is different. They increase costs. History offers many examples of this approach. Rather than seeking decisive military victory, smaller powers often attempt to convince larger opponents that maintaining continuous military pressure will become progressively more expensive over time. That strategy depends less on battlefield success than on endurance. Political leaders must continually weigh military objectives against economic pressures, alliance management, domestic politics, and public opinion. Those calculations have become increasingly complex during the 21st century. Energy markets illustrate why. Despite rapid advances in renewable technology, global energy demand remains closely connected to hydrocarbons. Emerging economies continue expanding industrial production, transportation networks, and electricity generation, creating sustained demand across multiple fuel sources simultaneously. At the same time, the transition toward cleaner energy introduces new dependencies. Large-scale electrification requires massive quantities of copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, aluminum, and other strategic minerals. Mining, processing, transportation, and manufacturing all remain deeply connected to existing global logistics systems. In other words, traditional energy markets and future energy systems remain more interconnected than many public discussions acknowledge. That broader economic reality means stability in major shipping corridors continues to matter not only for oil producers, but for manufacturers, financial institutions, technology companies, and governments around the world. This is why regional developments increasingly attract global attention. They are no longer viewed purely through a military lens. They are evaluated as part of a much larger economic system. The same evolution is visible in international diplomacy. Regional governments today rarely define their foreign policy through exclusive partnerships with a single global power. Instead, many pursue diversified relationships, maintaining security cooperation with one country while expanding trade, investment, and infrastructure partnerships with others. This approach reflects changing incentives rather than sudden political realignment. Economic resilience has become a strategic objective alongside military security. For policymakers, that means influence increasingly depends on offering reliable economic partnerships in addition to traditional defense commitments. Military presence alone is no longer sufficient to shape long-term regional outcomes. That observation leads to perhaps the most important question of all. How should analysts measure power in today's international system? Traditional metrics, military spending, troop numbers, naval tonnage, while aircraft inventories remain important, but they no longer tell the entire story. Economic endurance, technological adaptation, financial resilience, industrial capacity, supply chain security, diplomatic flexibility, and institutional credibility all contribute to strategic influence. When viewed through that broader framework, developments in the Persian Gulf become part of a much larger global transition. The central issue is no longer whether one country can win a single confrontation. It is whether the international system itself is gradually shifting toward a more complex balance in which multiple regional and global powers exercise greater influence simultaneously. That possibility does not necessarily imply the collapse of any existing order. History rarely changes so abruptly. Instead, strategic transitions usually unfold gradually, as governments adapt to evolving economic realities, changing technologies, and shifting political incentives. Recognizing those structural changes may ultimately prove more important than following any single headline, because while individual crises eventually pass, the underlying strategic environment often continues evolving long after public attention has moved elsewhere. And understanding that evolving framework may be the key to understanding what comes next not only in the Persian Gulf, but across the wider international system itself. If the first question is whether the strategic environment is changing, the second is even more important. What happens when every major player begins adjusting to that new reality at the same time? International politics rarely changes because one country suddenly becomes stronger than everyone else. More often, change occurs because multiple governments gradually begin making different assumptions about the future. That process is already visible across the broader Middle East. Rather than preparing for a single decisive confrontation, many regional governments appear increasingly focused on reducing long-term vulnerability. Energy partnerships have diversified. Infrastructure investment now stretches across multiple continents. Financial cooperation involves a wider range of institutions than it did only a decade ago. Even security relationships have become more flexible than the alliance structures that dominated much of the post-Cold War era. None of these developments necessarily replaces existing partnerships. Instead, they reduce dependence on any single one. From a strategic perspective, that distinction matters enormously. Countries rarely abandon established relationships overnight. They gradually expand their options. The result is a more complicated regional balance in which influence depends not only on military capability, but also on economic credibility, diplomatic consistency, technological cooperation, and financial resilience. This broader context also changes how military power should be understood. Possessing overwhelming force is not the same as being able to use it without significant consequences. Modern conflicts increasingly demonstrate that precision weapons, advanced aircraft, and sophisticated naval forces operate within political and economic constraints that previous generations of strategists rarely had to consider. Every military decision now carries financial implications. Energy markets react. Shipping routes adjust. Insurance costs change. Investment flows shift. Governments must evaluate not only military objectives, but also the economic aftereffects that can spread far beyond the original area of tension. For that reason, deterrence itself has evolved. It is no longer based solely on preventing military defeat. It increasingly involves convincing competitors that escalation would impose unacceptable political or economic costs on everyone involved. This dynamic encourages caution even among powerful states. That caution should not automatically be interpreted as weakness. Sometimes restraint reflects strategic calculation rather than declining capability. History repeatedly shows that great powers often preserve long-term influence by avoiding unnecessary commitments rather than pursuing every available military advantage. The challenge, however, is that restraint can also reshape perceptions. Allies closely observe how security commitments are implemented. Competitors study every response. Financial markets rapidly incorporate changing expectations into investment decisions. As perceptions evolve, Strategic behavior evolves with them. This is one reason why credibility remains one of the most valuable assets in international politics. Credibility influences deterrence. It influences alliance management. It influences diplomacy. And perhaps most importantly, it influences whether governments believe future agreements will remain durable beyond the next election cycle or political transition. Long-term consistency, therefore, becomes a strategic resource in its own right. The same principle applies to the global economy. For decades, international trade expanded under relatively predictable assumptions regarding shipping security, financial settlement systems, and reserve currencies. Those assumptions still largely hold today. But many governments are simultaneously exploring complementary systems that increase resilience against future disruptions. Alternative payment arrangements, regional financial cooperation, expanded currency agreements, and diversified investment networks are gradually becoming more common. These developments should not necessarily be viewed as replacing existing institutions. Rather, they reflect efforts to reduce concentration risk within an increasingly interconnected global economy. Energy plays a central role in that process. Reliable access to energy remains essential for industrial production, transportation, manufacturing, and technological development. Even countries aggressively investing in renewable energy continue requiring stable supplies of conventional energy during the transition period. Consequently, stability across major maritime corridors retains global strategic significance regardless of how rapidly new energy technologies develop. This helps explain why developments around the Persian Gulf continue attracting worldwide attention. They affect far more than regional security. They influence inflation expectations, industrial planning, commodity markets, investment decisions, government budgets, corporate supply chains, and ultimately, consumer prices around the world. When viewed from that perspective, the Persian Gulf becomes less a regional issue and more a global economic intersection. That broader perspective also reveals why strategic competition increasingly extends beyond military deployments. Infrastructure financing, technology investment, port development, digital connectivity, industrial partnerships, critical mineral supply chains, artificial intelligence, semiconductor manufacturing. These areas now influence national security almost as directly as traditional defense planning. Modern strategy has become multi-nation. Military power remains important. Economic capacity matters equally. Technological leadership increasingly determines long-term competitiveness. Institutional stability influences every other variable. For analysts attempting to understand future developments, this complexity creates both challenges and opportunities. The temptation is to focus on dramatic headlines, yet history often moves through gradual structural adjustments rather than dramatic turning points. Major transformations usually become obvious only after years of accumulated change. Looking back, observers frequently describe them as inevitable. Living through them, however, rarely feels that way. That is precisely where today's international system may stand, whether one describes it as strategic competition, multipolar adjustment, or simply geopolitical evolution. Governments appear increasingly focused on preparing for a world in which influence is distributed across multiple centers rather than concentrated within one. That does not imply confrontation is unavoidable, nor does it suggest cooperation is disappearing. In reality, both trends can and often do develop simultaneously. Competition may intensify in some areas while collaboration expands in others. Security rivalry can coexist with economic interdependence. Diplomatic disagreements may occur alongside growing commercial partnerships. Understanding these overlapping realities requires moving beyond simple narratives of victory or decline. Perhaps the more useful question is this: which governments are building the greatest ability to adapt as global conditions continue changing? History suggests adaptability often proves more valuable than short-term advantage. The strongest states are not always those with the largest militaries or the biggest economies. They are often those capable of adjusting strategy without losing institutional stability. That principle has shaped international politics for centuries. It is likely to shape the decades ahead as well. For that reason, the most significant developments may not be the dramatic moments that dominate headlines. They may be the quieter shifts occurring beneath the surface changes in investment patterns, energy relationships, technological cooperation, diplomatic engagement, and long-term strategic planning. Those gradual adjustments rarely attract immediate attention, yet they often determine the direction of history long before the rest of the world recognizes that the rules themselves have begun to change. And as always, the greatest strategic transformations are usually understood most clearly only after they are already well underway.